Hey folks, Nathan here. We are finishing our coverage, finally, after a bit of a delay here, for Tiny Epic Dungeons. I did some sort of early coverage of this game. I was an honorary producer backer, which basically meant that I had a prototype of both the base game and its expansion very early, and then I had a finished copy early before the regular distribution for the Kickstarter happened. So we got a chance to look at those, compare the finished product to the prototype, and that sort of thing. But there was one kind of set of things that was still hanging over us when I finished that coverage, which was the fact that there were a bunch of add-ons for the game. And even if you were an honorary producer who got the finished game and expansion early, you didn't get your add-ons early. The add-ons shipped with all the other Kickstarter pledges. So, in a matter of months, those finally arrived, and I haven't had a chance to show you those yet. That's what we want to do here. This will finish out our coverage here for Tiny Epic Dungeons. That said, let me say, I apologize ahead of time. This has been so long ago when the pledges were actually made for these and confirmed and everything else that I no longer have a listing of the prices for the individual items here. I usually try to address those when I'm talking about the coverage of something from Kickstarter, even if it's Kickstarter add-ons that were added in the Pledge Manager later, like in this case through CrowdOx, but I can't see a listing of the prices anymore. So I will just show you what these add-ons are so you kind of know what they are, what's available out there, and then, price-wise, it'll just be up to, if you're looking for any of these, looking on, say, Gamelin Games' website when they make them available or elsewhere. I just can't tell you them here because I don't have that information readily available anymore. As a bonus, one of the extra items that was an add-on for this was a revised remastered edition of Michael Coe's Dungeon Heroes game from 2013. We'll take a brief look at that here, and I hope to do a more detailed look at a comparison of the original game to the remastered edition sometime in the near future. So, let's dive into the extras, as you see packaged here, for Tiny Epic Dungeons. And one thing that they did with this, they really went all out, as you can see here, in that Tiny Epic Dungeons actually has its own carrying material here. You have a bag with a bunch of stuff inside it, and then you also have a playmat, and the playmat was provided, unlike many of the earlier playmats, provided actually in a box. So that gives you one place to store it rather than needing to necessarily replace it with like a post or two, though I know some still do that. It actually will fit within the wrapping here, within these handles here, whether it's in the box or not. I kept mine in the box, so I didn't have to toss the box or put it somewhere else. So they've really kind of taken it up a notch. We have a bag full of stuff and the mat in the box all put together. They've never done this for a Tiny Epic game before, so it's pretty cool that this happens to be the one they did it for, because it is my favorite and the one I did the honorary producer thing for, and thus have been covering here on the channel. So I've babbled a little bit. Let's dive in. First, we've got the playmat here. Right, the box here says official game mat. This is the so-called game area or play area mat here. It's 26 by 26 inches or 66 by 66 centimeters. Packaging says official game mat. The back gives you a little bit of a preview of what it's going to look like. Up your game and throw down this mat. This is the mat, which we will use as our background here, but I will move the camera around a little bit here to start with in order to just show you what exactly it is here that you're getting. So again, it is 26 inches by 26 inches, so it fits nicely on a card table, but not with a whole lot of extra room or anything. You have the logo up here, and then all these spaces are where your dungeon cards will go. They have the entrance printed on it, so you could put the card here or just use where it's already printed. They can't put the dungeon layer on there, the boss layer card on there, the layer entrance, because of course that will change location. But notice this has room for the entire grid, because you never go more than 3 vertically or horizontally from the entrance, so your grid can only be a maximum of 7 by 7. The top right corner has the Tiny Epic Dungeons name, the copyright, and the Gamelin Games logo there in the corner. And then running down the side here, you got places for your various decks. And remember, there's a discard pile for some of these decks. So you need a place to put the discard pile and kind of spread it out, because that discard pile or discard row is where you can acquire things from when it comes to loot or spells. So they not only have the spaces for them, but a place for discards. And in the case of the ones that are discard rows, are just meant to kind of just zoom out to the side over here. So let's take a look at that real quick. So we have a place there for potions, from Potions and Perils in the deluxe base game, for spells, for loot. We have a place for the cards for the minions and for the goblins. We also have places for the story cards if you're playing with stories, and the markers that go with them, the A and B markers that go with them. Not necessarily to put there, but to let you know like which is which. A and B are also mentioned there. And a place for your dungeon cards that'll eventually be used to create your dungeon here. We then have a place to put the boss mat. You will need to put the actual boss mat, the boss oversized card here, because of course on the back is where you track the minion health markers to show you when it's unlocked, and that's not listed on here, so it's just giving you a place to put that oversized card. Then as you go right from there, notice you have 4 goblin slots with the goblin symbols up above for each of them. So in theory, instead of putting the goblins above or below the torch mat, you can put them here and match them with the numbers, which is important because to their right here, you have a place for the actual torch mat, but because the torch mat is different depending on which side you're on, which act you're in, Act 1 or 2, notice here, nothing is actually marked on here. So you do need to put the mat here, but there wouldn't be room necessarily below, depending on your table, and certainly not above, to put your goblins, hence having slots there. And then, of course, the minions go out to the right of that torch mat based on the way it's designed. So there's a place to put those, and again, have them running off to the right, off the edge of the mat. So a pretty nice overall playmat here, I think. There is some consternation, though, because if you look down, there's like this weird outline here that doesn't match the spaces between the dungeon cards that are marked here with the darker areas. So there's some question as to whether that is intentional design or somebody screwed up, probably the latter, when making the design, because you can see that sort of outline of a darker line with 2 lighter lines around it running vertically through each of these spaces to help you line up the dungeon cards with them, and yet the line you would expect to go horizontally is typically a little bit down from where you would expect it to be. It's probably an error. Don't know if they will ever fix it or if that is just now part of the design. Otherwise, you see the designs here that are basically a map of Ogmore or parts of Ogmore underneath. So kind of a nice design underneath everything else here. So having looked at the game area mat, now let's look at the bag. And here's the weird thing about the bag. You've probably noticed it if you paid close attention as I've shown it here a couple times. Where does it open? On the bottom. It's like slitting open the stomach of the Tauntaun from underneath. What? Apparently it has to do with, I guess, just easy access with the different handles up there on the top, but it is a bit odd to open from the bottom. If it ever breaks somehow as you're walking with it because of weight, it theoretically could dump everything. But you're not meant to carry really heavy stuff in here, just the game stuff, so it doesn't appear to be an issue yet, but still a little bit weird. But as far as the bag goes, you get an insulated interior here. It's meant to be insulated in case you want to carry your lunch. Yes, carry your lunch that needs to be refrigerated in there with your games, because that's always safe. But then you get the cover art here, basically, with Gamelin Games there, and the title and all. The back is effectively the same thing. The sides, Adventure Awaits. And Adventure Awaits, same thing. The top is just sort of that greenish artwork there. But then you've got 3 of these that loop around that you can clasp to hold your mat, or the mat in the box. And then the actual handle, which does the whole thing where it can open for ease of getting to stuff. Though, you know, unless it's ease of putting the mat in there, I'm not sure why it really needs it, because again, the opening is at the bottom. But a nice little bag, first time they've ever done a bag like this for a Tiny Epic game. Now, of course, you would store the game itself in there. This is the deluxe version. You would store your stories expansion in there as well. I actually also store my premium prototype in there, which I now have in a protective bag so it doesn't get damaged or anything. That is stored in there for me as well. There's just barely enough space for all the stuff I'm going to show you here, but of course not having the prototype in there gives you a little bit more leeway. You then have this flattened out thing. Well, what is this? It says Tiny Epic Dungeons on either side and has that cool gold design. Well, this, with the snaps, this is a dice tray. So you snap all of these together on the corners to create your dice tray. Although the snaps, because of the material here and the fact that it's not really folded, you know, it tends to be kept flat when you're storing it, the snaps, until they've all snapped, do tend to kind of pop off pretty easy. So we go from that to that. a nice little dice tray, right? A nice little hexagonal dice tray. I've got this one. I've got one of these actually for Nemesis that was part of the second Kickstarter, which eventually, hopefully, we'll take a look at as well because I've done a lot of Nemesis coverage before. But this is thicker than and sturdier than the one for Nemesis if you happen to have that kind of thing to compare it to. But it is a portable little dice tray. The difference being this one gets kept flat and can't be rolled up. The one for Nemesis, because it is all essentially cloth, can be rolled up. So your mileage will vary on that sort of thing. But this is designed, when kept flat, to be just barely small enough to fit inside the bag. Or vice versa, the bag just barely big enough to fit it. Another add-on was to get 3 more sets of the hero and enemy dice. I have just put them into a little container that I bought, somewhere years ago. You won't really need this. This is just kind of a nice little add-on so you don't have to keep sharing dice if you're playing with more than one player, if you're playing more than solo. And no, you will never roll more than 3 of the hero dice or 1 enemy die. So it literally is for more players to play, and for that convenience factor, it's not helping you to keep from re-rolling anything or anything like that. I just put it in one of these little containers to keep them safe because I have my cards sleeved in the boxes so there isn't room for all these extras to be crammed into the boxes. Another optional purchase were game mats for the individual hero players. Very much like what you would see with Tiny Epic Kingdoms Heroes Call or Tiny Epic Pirates. So we have Tiny Epic Dungeons, official game mats, 8.75 inches by 9.75 inches or 22 by 25 centimeters. Includes 4 mats, Gamelin logo there. Again, up your game, throw down these mats, etc., kind of stuff here. These, though, are all 4 different designs to be used for the players. So we'll look at each design here in turn. We've got this design, kind of like the portal in the background, very dark. Not my favorite of the designs. It tends to be one that folks refer to as kind of a mushy artwork. But again, it's artwork on neoprene, so what do you expect all that much? But it's got places for all the stuff that you would need to put as your hero. You have a place to put your hero card, which has all the stats for the character, a place to put their garb, right? The place to put their armor or whatever it might be, 2 hand slots to include whatever it is they're carrying in their hands, whether it's a weapon or whatever, 2 spots here for the trinkets, which do not normally have a spot like around the card, right? The card has its own spots for this stuff, just to sit next to it or slightly overlap the card. You just keep the trinkets separate. Now there are places for them. Same thing with your up to 2 spells or up to 2 potions. 1 slot for each. The plus there meaning, you kind of put them all together, and it's got that opening on the side so they can go out in a row off to the side. Second mat design here, honestly, is also a bit messy looking. It's got sort of that red, almost a flame or design or whatever down at the bottom. I don't know what it's supposed to be, but kind of dark there. Then you got one that I think is a little bit nicer. It's got that sort of fiery background to it. And then finally, you've got this one, which is probably my favorite because it is the clearest image, I think, on any of them, which is sort of like the interior of a building with the giant doors there going outside. Not that you're really going to be looking at the artwork all that much because you're going to have all your game components on it. It's meant to help you keep your stuff organized so that you don't just organize your garb and the stuff that goes in your hands and whatnot. It also helps you organize your spells, your potions, and your trinkets. But I would agree that they are not the best art that we've seen from player mats or hero mats in this case for a Tiny Epic game. At least not as far as the background art goes. But very functional and pretty useful if you're trying to keep track of all your bits and pieces and want a way to do that visually. Now, if there's one thing that was the absolute most requested thing as far as new add-ons for this game was concerned, during the Kickstarter itself, it was for boss meeples. Because in the game, even though the minions are all represented by meeples that match those characters, and the goblins are represented by the 4 different numbered goblin meeples, the boss was just represented by this thing, regardless of which boss it was. Or a red version of this if you were playing with 2 bosses using stories. That was not really ideal given that, you had miniatures for all the heroes, and the goblins, even though there were different types with different cards, represented by at least 4 different goblin meeples, and then you had minions that all had their own, and yet the boss was just this thing? That was just weird. Granted, you're only ever playing with 1 boss per game, so you don't necessarily need to distinguish them when they're on the playing area. And when you do play with stories, you would have maybe two. You'd have a red one to go with this. But still, it felt weird not giving the bosses representation in a more visually satisfying way. So Boss Meeples was another add-on, an add-on that includes all the boss meeples for all the bosses found in the main game, the deluxe version with potions and perils, and for the Stories expansion. So for the base game, not counting the deluxe edition's Potions and Perils mini expansion that we'll look at next, we have 6 boss meeples, all as part of this pack of 10 that you could get all at once. It was not something that they broke down into smaller packs or anything. So we now have one for the Hydra, the Seer, the Dragon, the Pharaoh, the Gorgon, and the Goblin King. By the way, here's a quick size comparison. Hydra boss, much bigger than the Dire Serpent minion, which itself is bigger than the goblins. So they do increase in size as they increase in essentially rank within the game. Then, of course, the Potions and Perils mini expansion found in the deluxe version of the game adds 2 more bosses, the Demon Lord, who now has his own meeple, and then the Lich, who now has his own meeple. And then the Stories expansion brought 2 more bosses. We have the Tinkerer, who now has his own, and then the Mind Flayer. That then brings us to an oddball thing that was the last add-on available within the Pledge Manager, and that is a remastered edition of Dungeon Heroes. You may know that Scott Almes does the design for the Tiny Epic series of games, but it's from Gamelin Games, which is headed by a guy named Michael Coe. Michael Coe, back in 2013, put out Dungeon Heroes. This is the original version of the game, and then it actually had 2 expansions to go with it, 2 mini expansions included in the same little box. You had Lords of the Undead, as you see here, or the Dragon and the Damsel, right? But they were both in the same box here, 2 expansions in one. Well, now, thanks to the Kickstarter for Tiny Epic Dungeons bringing up interest again in Dungeon Heroes, they've finally gone through and done a remaster, a tweaked version, mostly tweaked in terms of its looks, not its gameplay, for Dungeon Heroes. And in this case, it includes 2 expansions, the Dragon and the Dryad, not Damsel, and Lords of the Undead, so both of those with some changes, minor changes, to one of them in the box itself. The game and its packaging has undergone a substantial facelift. The meeples are still the same, which is nice because there were some really cool meeples back in the day. We'll be looking at this hopefully as a separate video. I want to do a couple of quick comparison shots here, though, and give you a quick sort of side comment on that change to the expansion. The game board itself has changed looks significantly. The original was much darker looking, very thematic, but didn't really have any helpful stuff on it at all. It was just the playing area itself with some graphic design, whereas the new one is easier to sort of keep an eye on the different areas and whatnot. It has reminders about certain things off to the side and help for both players, because this is a 2-player or solo game, help for the heroes or dungeon lord players in the corners. So it's a more functional board now and a much brighter looking board. It fits more with the tone of what you'd see with something like the Tiny Epic games rather than Dungeon Heroes back in the day. The boards for the heroes are also much nicer looking in terms of graphic design. The original version here on the top and the remastered version here on the bottom for the warrior. Functionally the same, but it helps with the names of certain things, helps clarify things, and it's just a nicer contrast to the design. Same artwork, though, you'll notice. The rulebook is also now an actual rulebook, a very nicely laid out rulebook, whereas originally it was a 2-sided main sheet for the 2-player mode, and then if you wanted to play solo, all the information needed for that particular variant was a little booklet here. And of course now, the rules for the 2 expansions are also included in the main rulebook instead of separately. The expansion rules were this fold-out back in the day with the Dragon and the Damsel on one side, and then Lords of the Undead on the other, and folded up for the packaging. Then the other thing that they have done, and I'm assuming this is because of how sensibilities have changed in the near decade since this game was originally released, is the Damsel who is basically in like a skirt and I don't even know what you would call that top there, what exists of it. That character and her token, which has her artwork on it here, along with her old meeple and old character board, has been replaced instead with basically the art of Evelyn, the Dryad Druid from Tiny Epic Dungeons. That, if you're playing with the mini, is this character here from Stories. This character card here if you're playing Dungeons. But now she has this board. Obviously, the design and everything changed, but notice the artwork here is now from Evelyn there. The meeple is now fitting that pose. And the art on her token is now fitting that as well. The dice, yes, did change color from pink to sort of this red with a pattern, but all the dice have changed to have a little bit more of a pattern, be a little nicer looking dice. We'll look at that when we look at the games in depth. But suffice to say, the big change, if you want to call it a big change, other than the visual overhaul, is that the dragon and the damsel became the dragon and the dryad, and the damsel design became Evelyn, essentially, from Tiny Epic Dungeons. So, there you have it. All these add-ons that could have been found for Tiny Epic Dungeons during its Kickstarter Pledge Manager phase. For what it's worth, most of these will be available otherwise, probably through the Gamelin Games website, more so than anywhere else. They are out there if you want to try to get your hands on them to enhance your Tiny Epic Dungeons experience. And with that, I believe our Tiny Epic Dungeons coverage comes to an end. Keep an eye out, though, because I do intend on eventually hitting Dungeon Heroes when the opportunity arises. Thanks, and enjoy Tiny Epic Dungeons.